Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Moonrise Human Design. Whether you're listening to the podcast or watching us on YouTube, we are so thrilled that you are here to join us for a really down and dirty conversation about the spleen center. I actually
If
find I
I
find
was
this
going to
center.
describe the spleen in one way, I'd definitely say down and dirty.
We gotta get down and dirty today because the spleen, I find the spleen to be the most difficult center to describe when I'm doing readings. So I'm actually really looking forward to hearing your takes on this, Sam. Of course, you're Samantha Fotenhauer. My name is Nadia Last. We love human design. We love talking about it and sharing it. And yeah, we're just continuing our deep dive on each of the nine centers, which are the shapes in human design. And if you haven't listened, you should absolutely go back and listen to our more recent episodes on the heart center, on the G center. We talked about the solar plexus several weeks ago, and they're really deep dive conversations. And it's very cool we're talking about the spleen today. We are in the midst of our human design training right now. And we talked about the spleen last night in class, and it just brought up so many interesting nuggets and tidbits. And I'm just excited to explain more about it in personal anecdotes today.
Me too. So, for anyone who's catching us for the first time, Nadia and I teach human design. Nadia is a therapist based outside of San Francisco. I do spiritual healing and emotional health work, and I'm located in Austin. And we love to teach and talk about human design, and we love to talk about the centers. And the centers, so go to Moon, if you don't have your chart, go to moonrisecommunity.com, pull your free chart. That's our website. And you'll see a bunch of shapes. Nine shapes are in the triangles and squares that make up your chart. And then they'll have different numbers and lines coming from them. And the shapes are energy hubs, kind of loosely connected to the chakra system. And these energy hubs all have different themes within them. So, one of the energy hubs, the solar plexus, is about emotions. We had an episode on that. One of them is about willpower and drive, the heart. We had an episode on that. The spleen is about fear and anxiety. And particularly, it's about survival. It's also intuitive knowing. There's many places intuition can come through the human design chart, but it's one of the probably most prominent or most definitely we use the word intuition the most when speaking about the spleen. And so today's episode, we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about themes of safety, fear, trust of your body, health, wellness. Nadia, is there any overview you want to do the spleen, or do you want to describe what a defined spleen looks like?
I'd love to just overview what the center is. So if you're looking at your chart, which we encourage you to pull up while you're listening to this, the spleen is the bottom left-hand corner of the chart, and it is the triangle. And so when you look at that center, figure out, is it colored in? Is it full of color or is it white? And so that will tell you whether you are defined or undefined, respectively. And we'll talk about that. But just knowing what energy is created in the spleen is responsible, as Sam was talking about, for survival, well-being. It's kind of like the body's internal alarm system, telling us in any moment, am I safe or am I not safe here? Can I be spontaneous? Can I take up joy in this present moment? Or is there something that I need to be cautious or wary about? And I think we've all had these experiences in our lives, whether you're defined or undefined, where you walk into a room or into an environment and you're like, there's something off here. Like I should be, it's kind of like the hair raising on your arms or at the back of your neck, and this feeling of like, proceed with caution, or maybe take a step back, or maybe just pause for a second. There is more information to take in here than can be kind of picked up with your five senses. And the spleen creates that kind of internal sense of what is safe or what is not. And actually, according to human design, something I find really fascinating, this is the first center apparently that was developed in humans, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about, but it's the most primal of all of the centers because it creates this almost primal instinctual awareness. When you're running through a field, all of a sudden you stop and you're like, actually, I feel eyes on me. And maybe it's that there's a lion several yards away, but it's like if you think about this, the spleen, it was created in almost like hunter-gatherer times.
I'm taking a look at some of human design charts of people in my life because the Well, I'll come back to that. I'll come back to why I'm doing that in a minute. The spleen, it not only was the first, but it's also one of the centers that exists in plants. And it, Nadia, correct me if I'm wrong, like all animals and all plants, because it's responsible for survival, as Nadia was saying, and responsible for life. And so this is the one that looks at what's going to keep my body alive. What's going to make sure that we stay safe? What's best for my well-being? And similarly, what because it's where am I safe, it's also what am I afraid of? Because fear can indicate to us things that aren't safe. But as I think probably all of you know or have experienced, fear can also be a trick or false. It can be representative of an insecurity that we have or a fear of experiencing a certain emotion. Fear can keep us in situations that actually are not healthy for us because it feels so scary to leave them. And so the spleen can kind of bring up some challenges with fear, learning how to be wise with fear, how to use it, but also um, how to not let it keep you in something um, that isn't actually for your best, your well-being ultimately. And that's partly because our needs for survival have shifted a lot. We're not anymore living in a forest. Like we don't need to run away from tigers. So we do have threats to our well-being. But what is safe for us can look pretty different, I think, evolutionary than it did 100 or 500 or 3,000 years ago.
1000% Sam. That was very well articulated. And I think just a reminder for everyone that what we're talking about here, the fears that are generated, there are healthy fears where it's like, yeah, of course, I shouldn't touch that stove because that's going to burn my hand. And then there are fears that start out maybe healthy, but then they take on a life of their own. And then it's anxiety. And then it's these fears where it's acting on my body in a way day in and day out. But actually, there are no external stimuli that are actually creating that need for that fear to exist. So I think that's why this is such a rich conversation today for people to start to examine the fears that exist in their lives. And are they here for a reason or can they be questioned in a way that you kind of talk down the anxiety or the fears that have run away from themselves or taken on a life of their own?
I would love to start just giving some examples about this. So maybe Nadia, we could do an overview of defined and undefined. So Nadia has a defined spleen. So on the left, it's colored in, and you're looking particularly for the center. If you're at all confused, it's the one that has the numbers 57, 44, 50 in it. So Nadia, what does a defined spleen mean?
Yeah. So one of the reasons we love teaching human design, one of many, is that Sam and I have opposite definitions. So Sam's going to speak to the undefined experience, and I have a defined spleen. So it's very interesting actually to hear about the opposite. But having a defined spleen when you have it colored in simply means that you have consistent access to the energy that's generated in the spleen, which is this awareness and internal alarm system of what is safe or not for your well-being. And the way that I experience it is that there's almost this instantaneous body-based knowing that happens when I am eating a food. And I can tell I actually was eating Indian food last night that my husband lovingly ordered for us. And I took a few bites and I was like, I feel that this is too heavy for my body right now. Like I feel that this doesn't quite feel healthy, even though it was made with vegetables. And there's just kind of this innate connection to the well-being of your body and you are emanating that energy. So rather than being more attuned to other people's health and well-being, you're really primarily attuned to your own survival and the instincts of how to keep your body safe and well. This can also happen in moments of conversation with a new person, and maybe you're interviewing them for a job, and you just have this sense nothing is going wrong. They're saying all the right things, but you have this sense something is a little off with this person. And maybe you are the one person to raise the flag, and there's a panel of other interviewers, and the person gets hired. And a few months down the road, something comes to light that starts to make that initial instinct make sense to your mind. That's what's very interesting about the spleen is that it speaks in the present moment. It's a body-based emanation of awareness. And it takes sometimes the mind a little bit to catch up. And the mind can often convince the body, like, hey, you actually didn't feel anything there, or it's not that big of a deal. Just hire the person. So if you have a defined spleen, it's all about learning to recognize those kind of like instantaneous twinges of there's something to pay attention to here, not dismissing it and learning to trust it.
So we often say, defines people, you're very intuitive. And I do think I want to be careful here because I have an open spleen, but I'm also very intuitive. I think everybody can be very intuitive, but defined spleen people, your intuition will speak through your body and it will tell you this is right for you and this isn't. And it can, Nadia often describes it as a spidey sense. It can be this knowing, it can be this, as you said, like I ate this and it just wasn't right for me. So this repelling, but so much I think of really harnessing the gifts the defined spleen requires you to be connected to your body. So Nadia, could you actually speak on how it's different in times of your life where your move Nadia exercise has a regular exercise practice and she talks about a lot of how helpful it is where you're moving regularly, where maybe you're doing some sort of meditation or mindfulness, where you're eating healthy, you're literally asking yourself, how am I feeling, versus times in your life, um, maybe you haven't had one of these for a while, but where you're not moving, where you are not asking yourself, maybe you're drinking a lot of alcohol and you're not in connection. How does the spleen differ in those two instances?
It's a great question. And no matter what your definition is, it is important for people to find some sort of physical movement practice. I actually just finished reading the book Outlive by Peter Attia.
Huge Outlive stan over here. Love Peter
People love
Attia.
it.
My mom is like, she, Peter Attia comes out of her mouth at least once a conversation.
Well, Jodi's a defined spleen galley.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it one of the quotes in the book, I actually find it to be a little bit verbose for my taste, but I still think they're really great tenets there. But one thing that he said, he's like, exercise is the number one way to keep your body highly functioning, period. Like if you want to have longevity in life, exercise is the number one antidote. Everything else is on top of it, of course, what we eat, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, I digress. It actually is an important conversation, though, for the spleen conversation, like outlive and longevity and connecting with our bodies, the wisdom of our bodies. Having a defined spleen, my experience of it is that there's this kind of like inner directed part that says, this is the type of workout that you need right now. And I'll go through seasons of different types of workouts. And when I am more healthy, meaning I'm connected with my body, I'm eating the right things, I'm moving my body every day, I feel like I can feel my intuition much more easily because I'm not fogged down or bogged down by things. And I'm in a season of my life where I have a lot of wonderful life milestones and celebrations where I inevitably drink. And I can tell after the weekends that I drink that I actually do feel less connected to that kind of spidey sense of synchronicity. When I'm connected to my spleen, moment by moment, I'm being led. And it's a very strange thing to say, but it's like I have exactly the right conversation about a book. And then that book comes up in another conversation. And then I walk into a coffee shop and there's the book. And like it's like I'm more connected to the breadcrumbs that are always available to us when we live a magical, spiritually connected life when I'm taking care of my physical vessel, because it's the vehicle through which all of these signs and signals are being communicated. That was kind of a lengthy answer, but did that?
No, that was a great answer. And I think an honest one too. And the way I've been thinking about this concept, I think this is true for everyone, defined spleen or open spleen, but this idea of our relationship with our intuition. And I think of our intuition, it's a little bit heady, but stay with me. Intuition is part of the soul. It's like part of the soul or this energetic body, this part of us that's kind of like this GPS operating system. And when we are clear, and that comes from when we're taking care of our bodies, when we're emotionally clear. So we're looking at anything coming up, we're giving ourselves space to experience and express our emotions. When we are not too mentally crowded, so we're not kind of over consuming tons of content. So we're clear in ourselves, it's like we can hear that GPS. The phone's brightness is on 100%, the volume's on. We can hear where that GPS is telling us. But when it gets foggy, when we've been drinking too much, or we're ignoring something emotionally, or we're taking in so much material, we're on TikTok tons of time a day, or we're taking in content 15 hours a day, it's like that phone gets way dimmer, and maybe the Google Maps is only on occasionally and we can't really hear it, and that GPS is no longer as available to us. And so one of the ways that we can be able to hear that and get that information is from caring with ourselves. And I think for defined spleen people, that's super important. I think it's important for everybody, but I'm trying to think about like what makes this different for defined spleen people. And I think what it is the way the intuition shows up and the way it communicates to you and through your body.
I actually have this new insight and I want to test it on you, Sam, that because Sam's spleen, we're going to get to it, is fully open. And in human design lingo, that just means that there's not a single gate activation there. There's a lot of openness, basically porousness. And I think in the same way that we described this in the G center episode, when you have a defined G center, you're more self-directed in your identity, whereas open G center people find their identity, but it's through trying things out. I wonder if that actually relates to health. With a defined spleen, I feel very self-directed in terms of like pings of what I need and when and where, and even kind of like knowing when certain things dip or certain things are off. Whereas I wonder if open spleen people, and you can let me know if this is right, almost need kind of like to try things on. Like I thought that I would try this diet, but actually as I feel it through my system, it doesn't feel as right. So it's like more trial and error to find what actually feels most healthy and correct.
I agree with that. And I think that's a really good insight. I never have thought about it in that language, but it makes a lot of sense to me because open spleen people don't have that. When it comes to health, that GPS system can be very sporadic. And so you kind of have to rely more on these outside takes. And maybe we can do a little overview of the open spleen and then we'll go into the health because I have a lot to share with you guys around this. I have some ideas. So well, the first thing I'll say is the spleen has been something that I've probably had the most amount of evolution with in my understanding and studying in the 6 years I've been studying human design. Because for the first few years, I was kind of confused by it. I didn't quite understand it. It's just one of the things that it keeps unfolding in my life. Because it's so open, and often this is the case with open centers, they're both our most challenging. They're places where we struggle the most and we can have the most wounding around, but there's the potential for the most amount of wisdom. So it would make sense that it would be a theme in my life, but I would keep learning from it if I'm open to learning. Open spleen people have an inconsistent, I like to think of it as an inconsistent alarm system. You think of an alarm system for your house. Sometimes it goes off when it's supposed to. Great. Sometimes it doesn't go off when it should, when there's an actual threat. And often it goes off when there is no threat. And all bodies, I truly believe, have an ability to tell if there's a serious threat to their safety. However, I do think the open spleen one, the threat to get that really clear alarm has to be present and it has to be like now. I find in moments of crisis, I do well. I don't think that's necessarily an open spleen thing, but it shows me like there is something. It's not like if I'm confronted with an actual threat, I understand that it's a threat. However, I have a very difficult time assessing risk ahead of time and have made a number of choices that were very unwise and didn't really have anything. And, safety things, getting in cars with strangers, like just not super smart, eating places where of course that would make you sick, like that sort of stuff. And then but we'll be very afraid of things that are probably really safe, like an Amazon person coming to my door. And so there can be this inconsistency of knowing what's safe and healthy for me. What this really shows up as, there's a few ways this particularly shows up. The first is that open spleen people will feel uneasy in being able to assess what's safe for them. So they'll tend to stay with habits that are comfortable for them or bring them a sense of safety. We often find safety in comfort. So comfort's a really good thing to look at, even if it's a habit, if it's just a part of your life. And so you'll stay with things like drinking too much or eating foods that make you sick. And the evidence is showing you they make you sick and you keep eating them because there's some sort of comfort in that. You may stay at jobs that don't fit you or relationships that are not right for you because it feels comfortable. Fear can be a very distorting, it can create a lot of distortion and it can easily, if we're afraid of something, it can almost prevent us from seeing it. So a client told me yesterday, she was like, now that I'm feeling just safer in my life, it's a lot easier to dream about things. I never had dreams before, but now that I feel safer, the dreams are, I'm starting to dream. And that's because if we're really afraid, it'll shut off our ability to dream. And I think something similar can happen with the open spleen. If we're afraid of something, it can almost trick us into think everything's fine here. We should just stay here. Like, let's not look and see what else might be here. And so that's how you can stay in a job that you hate for 20 or 30 years, because everyone can do this, but I think open spleen people, the reason that happens is because I'm comfortable here and I'm afraid of what the other option looks like. The other thing that open spleen people have a tendency to do, it's also their gift, is that they can, while they don't have their own alarm system, they can easily read into other people's and feel their sense of safety, health, well being, anxiety, fear. And so you can go talk to someone and I will literally feel fear on me. Like I can sense like, wow, that person has a lot of fear in their life. And I will feel it on me like I'm wearing a jacket. I can feel when I'm with clients and I have a lot of permission to like direct my energy into them where they're in discomfort, where energetically or where physically. And I will literally feel it in my body. I'll feel my throat get tight, or I'll feel, my heart get really tight sometimes before the session, and I'm like, oh, we're going to be working on heart stuff today or throat stuff today. It comes in, which is super cool. I think I have a very keen ability to I'll often know before someone discloses to me, like a friend, that they're struggling with mental health before. Like it's obvious to me, or I can see it, not in a bad way. It's just I feel like I can see the signs. And when I go into a room, I can very easily pick up on who's anxious. And so it can make being around people who are really anxious challenging for me because I can feel it. And open spleen people have a tendency to take on other those emotions and then feel like they need to fix it. So if you have a partner who's anxious, you may dismiss your needs or orient the whole day around trying to make them feel better, which is not a bad thing unless you're doing it unconsciously. Doing it occasionally can be great. That can be being a supportive partner. Doing it every day means that you're prioritizing somebody else over your own. And it's maybe to help them, but it may also be because you want to avoid that feeling of anxiety that you're picking up. So you don't want to be around it. So you try to remediate it.
Yes. It's so interesting. All the open centers have so much capacity for wisdom and feeling the energy of others and determining, like, is this healthy or not? Is this mine or not? And if you have an open spleen, just recognizing you walk through the world and you're going to feel people's fears. And so if you're making a big decision, how are you protecting yourself from other people's fears and learning to take in the fears that actually are healthy versus not? There's like a lot of discernment here. And people who have open spleens, I've noticed, can be really, really profound healers because they're here to reach into the health and well-being of another person's system and gain awareness. The spleen, each of the centers is categorized. Some have a couple different categorizations, but the spleen is an awareness center. It is here to bring awareness into our body that wasn't there before. So I think it's actually, I want to like thank open spleen people for choosing. I really deeply believe that every soul chooses their incarnation and the gifts that they have of like choosing to be in an incarnation where you're really feeling into the health of others. It feels so deeply in service to me when people are connected to the energies that they're taking in here.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, there can be these challenges with it, but I think it's really cool. And for my profession, it serves me a lot to be able to sense somebody's comfort levels. Open spleen people then can be great. That can be a tool you use a lot socializing because you can sense someone's uncomfortable and you have the opportunity then. You sense it, you can do something about it. You can invite those people into the conversation. You can introduce yourself. You can help make them feel more at ease if you want to, if you have the capacity for that. And that's the important thing to notice. I think important questions where you're likely to go off track is, am I avoiding something because it's scary? And that avoidance could actually be causing a lot of harm to yourself. Am I staying in something that isn't healthy for me because it just feels safer than the alternative? Or am I making myself smaller to help navigate or manage other people's temperances.
Mm-hmm. I know I'm like envisioning open spleen people like with hyperactive parents that have a lot of fear. And so they almost have to learn to lie or to make up little white lies about where they are or what they're actually doing because they're trying to protect their parent from feeling that level of fear and then how that shows up in their adult life. And I think having an open spleen is such an interesting experience because I will never know what that feels like. But I was with a friend in a nightclub once, and she has an open spleen, and she was like, "I just like the people around me feel really unhealthy." It's so interesting because in that moment, I was thinking like it's 2 a.m. Like my body doesn't feel very healthy right now. Like we've been drinking tonight. Like it was a preoccupation with my own well-being of like we should probably leave soon. I should probably switch to water, and she was so attuned to the people around us. And I think that's a great example of like what is happening in this moment. Are you attuned to your own health, or are you really, whether you want to or not, kind of attuning to the well-being of others?
I That's such a great point, and I think one of the reasons why I don't like to do substances anymore at or I'm just not doing substances at concerts, marijuana, like cannabis, any kind of low dose of psychedelics is because I have always been able to feel everyone's energy around me. And it used to get really distracting. Before I knew human design, I would be like, these people in front of me are like unwell. Like, I don't know how like stable they are. And I didn't know them. I could just feel it was like so obvious to me. Especially when I was in an altered state because psychedelics or cannabis can like heighten these senses within us. And it would get really distracting and it would make me really stressful. I would get really stressed
Mm.
being around, like I could really feel the energy of the people around me, and I would get scared because I wouldn't trust that the people around me were healthy within themselves. And then when you can tell that someone's not healthy, you don't trust them as much because you don't know how that disease might like actualize or come out in
Hmm.
life. Um, I think an exercise. So an exercise I like to do in this is can be great for anyone working with fear is, but I think especially for open spleen people, when you're thinking of making a decision, I like to take a piece of paper, draw in the middle a circle, and write um, the question like start this podcast or share my art on Instagram or quit this job. And I like to write everything on the left side of what I'm afraid of, including the worst case scenario. Because sometimes when we don't actually say it, it just feels like this giant shadow. And then once we actually say it, we're like, okay, the worst case scenario is that I lose my house and even then like I'd have somewhere to live. Or like the worst case scenario is to live in my car. Like really flesh out like what is the actual true worst case scenario, but everything else you're afraid of. And then spend as much time and as much side of the paper that you did that with everything that's possible and everything that you could create more. And then just sit with that. And I remember doing an exercise like that when I was leaving my job as a lawyer, which was very scary. And it was during COVID. There was a lot of financial fears, and a lot of people around me were scared for me financially because they were afraid. And I remember really sitting with myself and being like, I understand logically why someone would have this fear, but I'm not afraid of this. Like, this isn't a fear for me right now. Um, there are other fears, but once I kind of spelled them out, I realized like all the fears that I have, I can handle and are actually worth the potential upside. And that helped me move forward with fear, which I think is a really big lesson for open spleens. If you wait if you wait for there to be no fear, then you may be waiting forever. So you get wise with fear and you say, I am afraid of this, but here are all the other reasons. So I'm going to choose to move forward anyway. And I'm just going to prepare myself. Like you're going on a hike and like I might skin my knee, but I'll bring some band aids. So if I do that, it won't be that bad.
There's this amazing quote from Dune. And it says, "Fear is the mind killer." I will not something fear. I could look it up right now. But anyway, fear is the mind killer. And I think that it's such an iconic line because fear can really just take on a life of its own. And it's often the monster under our bed. And when we actually look under the bed, the monster isn't that scary. But it's so interesting fear as it emanates from the undefined spleen, taking it in externally and kind of like taking it and personalizing it oftentimes versus the defined spleen. something I want to make sure that we touch on before the end of this episode is that when you have a defined spleen, each of the gates in the spleen actually have a fear related to them. And so when you're looking at your chart and you're studying the different gates, and we are having a gate course upcoming that you will be able to download and dive into all the juiciness of each of the gates, pay attention to the fears that are there because human design teaches that when those fears show up, it's almost counterintuitive to how our body is wired biologically and evolutionarily to like there's a fear, there's a tiger, you should run the opposite direction. But human design teaches that when there's a fear, you're actually meant to really befriend it and say, okay, this fear is showing up. I must really care about this thing. This is something to pay attention to in and through, to move towards, and to allow it to be there as a signal that I really want this thing that I'm moving towards.
Do you have an example that you could share with people, like maybe with your fear of failure?
Yeah, it's so funny how casually you're like, that fear of failure you have.
So for people who are like, huh, the gate 32, which Nadia has in her spleen, it's what gives her a defined spleen, is associated with the fear of failure.
Yeah. And it's my only gate that I have actually activated in the spleen, which is so interesting if we want to talk about charts for a second. I'm splenic authority. Some people say splenic. I say splenic. So meaning my spleen is how I make decisions. So paying attention to the center is crucially important. I would say the most important center in the chart for me. And for everyone, whatever your authority is, I think is so important to sit with and contemplate. But I only have one gate activated here. And so all of my decision making energy is kind of filtered through this specific gate. It's called the gate of continuity. As a fun side note, I got married under the first day that the sun was in this gate. So that was kind of just like a wink from the universe. But it's about knowing what things have lasting values and knowing how things are evolving over time that will sort of stand the test of time. And as part of that, there is this fear of failure that as you go after the thing that you have this intuitive sense, this has lasting value. This is where society is moving. Like you can really place a bet here. There's this fear of failure that accompanies that. And I often kind of think of it as like walking on a tightrope where when you're up there and you're really going for it, of course you're going to be afraid that you fall because there's so much on the line. But when I have fear of failure show up, it's because it's like I want this thing. And if it didn't work out, I would be sad. I would be upset. I would care. There's skin in the game. There's a lot of things I do in my life where the fear of failure doesn't show up, and that shows me like this is a lot more mundane, or maybe this isn't my true north.
And I don't personally relate to that as a totally open spleen person. For those of you who are open but have those gates, you may still experience that. I do think there is something generally, like if I'm really afraid, there can be, but sometimes I'm really afraid and like it's just inconsistent. And it's like maybe there's that fear, but it's definitely not. There's things I'm afraid of failing at that I don't even want and that don't matter to me.
Yeah. I kind of actually, Sam actually just put all of the spleen gates in our chat that we have for human design training. And I kind of just want to read them out loud because we haven't talked about them in a podcast before, which I think is pretty cool. So, gate 48, the gate of depth, the fear that accompanies it is the fear of inadequacy, not, having enough. Gate 57, the gate of intuitive clarity, has the fear of the future and anticipating future outcomes. Gate 44, the gate of alertness, has the fear of the past and the past catching up to you. Gate 50, the gate of values, is the fear of responsibility and taking on too much responsibility in your life. Gate 32, the gate of continuity, is the fear of failure. Two more. Gate 28, the gate of the game player, has the fear of death and the fear of purpose. So not doing enough with your life before the clock runs out. And gate 18, the gate of correction, has the fear of authority. It's very interesting.
It is interesting. I would love to talk a little bit about the health things that we are referencing.
Yeah,
And
Sam, take it
so
away.
so I'm in the middle of this, so I'll have to update you all in about a month when I get on my test back. But I started experiencing some health issues. Some of them were somewhat new, fatigue, some hair loss, my hair is thinning again. But some of it, I say again because this turns out it keeps happening every time I give up meat that I lose a lot of my hair. And I'm always convinced that it's the best thing for me physically. But every time I've done it, I have clear, like obvious physical downsides that hit about 3 to 6 months after I really start and get into eating a vegetarian or mostly meatless diet, um, which is really interesting. I think that's an open indication of an open spleen of I can't tell. And so some of these are relatively new, but since some of them are old, chronic sinus issues for the last 20 years, chronic digestive issues. And I think a very classic open spleen thing. I knew I was lactose intolerant, but it was 10 years before I sincerely actually stopped eating dairy on a regular basis. I cut it down. I would cut out ice cream because I would just throw up afterward, but I would still eat cheese and then I would get a stomach ache every single day. But I would do it anyway because I liked it and probably because it made me feel comfortable. Food's such a source of comfort. I think back at my relationship with alcohol, and I had so many bad outcomes with alcohol, but I'd still drink frequently. And now I took an allergy test a month or 2 months ago, and it's one of those where they prick you at the allergist with, they pricked me with 58 environmental allergies. So, like grasses and trees and dust. And I was moderately to severely allergic to 44 of them, which is a lot. And I didn't know I had allergies. And that the part to me feels very open spleen. My doctor thinks I'm very sensitive to gluten. I didn't know I had a gluten sensitivity. I had cut it at times in my life before because I was heard that's good for you, but I didn't know. And a lot of the health implications that I've had, including this allergy is likely not just about allergies, it's likely related to the gluten or other dietary things because it's showing my immune system is very reactive. I would have thought that I was at the healthiest I've ever been. And I might be. My symptoms are a lot worse than they were, or a lot better than they were like 5 years ago. But it wasn't until a few months ago I was thinking about it and I was like, wait a minute. I live a very healthy lifestyle. Like I'm exercising regularly, I don't drink, I sleep 8 to 9 hours, and I'm not that stressed. I extremely high quality food. I'm 32. I should not be really tired in the middle of the day. Like something isn't adding up. And once I got all these tests done, there's actually a lot of things. Luckily, everything is relatively minor. It should be easily reversible and correctable with about a year of some adjustments and then maybe some forever lifetime adjustments. But I was thinking about how this feels open spleen to me because if I just relied on myself, I wouldn't know. But it was like my mind stepped in. It was like, something isn't right here. You should go talk to a good doctor. And then I saw the blood work and I'm like, this blood work isn't lying to me. These tests aren't lying to me. Maybe I'm not the best assessor. And I get confused with that because in many ways I really do trust my body. And I really believe on the times I didn't eat meat, I think that was important. I think maybe I wasn't supplementing or maybe there are other steps I need to take with it. So it's not that I don't think my body can communicate to me, but I think that it doesn't pick up on the subtle as much because I'm paying attention more to everyone else's.
It's so interesting because even as a defined spleen person, I find myself thinking like, I want to take all those tests. I want to know, like, there's so much there. I feel like for everyone, and it's very cool to be alive on this planet during a time where our testing is improving, and yeah, it's very cool. I'm like a lot. I'm subscribed to this health journey that you're taking, and I just want to reflect back, like how wild that this gluten allergy has been here likely your whole life and that there wasn't any indication to you. I mean, we love bread. Last time I saw you, we had the most delicious loaf of bread. I'm like, we got to find some good gluten-free options.
I know. And it's so interesting to me because it's like there, and this is a more complex thing than the open spleen. A lot of the foods that are mainstream in the American diet are toxic or unhealthy for a lot of people. And so it gets confusing. They can also make us like, because the food makes us think we want it, they can change our body's chemistry. We have a lot of conditioning. So it's doctors don't know. So even though some of these symptoms I've been seeing doctors or telling doctors for about 2 decades, they were not informed to know of the connection between some of these lifestyle dietary habits and the way it was showing up in my body. but still, I I've had this experience a lot where I'm like didn't know that there was something there, or I thought it was, but it was really quiet, and it was only because I love this stuff and I'm kind of like a nerd about well-being and growth, and so I'm always like eager to see what the next step is, that I decided to get it checked out. And now I view like as an open spleen practice, I'm like, I'm going to get myself in front of a doctor that I trust, that's kind of aligned with the way I like to approach health, once a year. And I'm just going to do some basic blood work and I'm going to do some of this stuff because if it you rely on me to know, I may never like I may not catch something and I don't want to go another decade.
I love that. And that might be a nice place for us to wind down the conversation today. I feel like we're just getting the spleen conversation going because there's so much nuance here. And, we'll come back around to the spleen. But if you have thoughts about this, we'd love to hear from you. Really a true, genuine invitation. And also, if you're interested in the gates that you have in your chart, look out for our human design gates course that is coming out sooner rather than later, and depending on when you listen to this. And you can take yourself through all 64 of the gates in human design in a much deeper dive than we know of that is accessible in various courses and teachers that we've come across. And that's why we created it.
Now we're going to have a very amazing Gates deep dive course. We're going to have a self-paced human design course with tons hours of lectures at a deep level on this content. And then if you're that'll all come out early 2025, but if you're really ready now, think about a guidebook. Our guidebooks are $60 and we have 2 pages on every single center. So you'll learn a lot, get a lot of tips in that way. Nadia, thank you so much for joining me here.
Yeah, it was so much fun, Sam. Go spleens, whether you're defined or undefined, go spleens.
Go Spleens. See y'all later.